Good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin this webinar, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we are gathered today across Australia. I pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land which the University of Sydney is built. These lands were taken without consent, treaty, or compensation. We honor and pay our respects to the Aboriginal elders past, present, and emerging, and to the enduring knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Welcome to this joint webinar, co-hosted by the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, or SIAC in short, and the Malaysian Singapore Society of Australia, or MASA, on the Singapore General Election 2025. My name is Dr. Yaotong Chia, and I'm the president of MASA and the country convener for Singapore at SIAC. SIAC is Australia's premier centre for interdisciplinary academic excellence on Southeast Asia. It brings together the expertise and collaboration of over 400 University of Sydney academics specializing in the region. MASA is the peak academic association for Malaysia and Singapore studies in Australia. Singapore's 2025 general election delivered a mixed result, sparking robust debate amongst political observers. Was it a flight to safety amid uncertainty, as Cherian George suggests? Or was it an reaffirmation of the People's Action Party's dominance and a mandate for Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, as reflected in the PAP's improved vote share? While the Workers' Party made modest gains in support, it secured no new seats. Most other opposition parties struggled, with several candidates losing their deposits. What do these outcomes reveal about shifting political sentiments in Singapore? Are we witnessing the emergence of a two-party system or retrenchment of opposition politics? Today's webinar will be moderated by Mr. Ho Yong Lok, a political analyst and author of the book The First Wave, A History of the Opposition in Singapore. His commentary has appeared in various outlets like Economist, BBC News, New York Times, amongst others. I will now hand over to Ho Yong to moderate the session and introduce our speakers.
Thank you very much, Yao Tong, for that kind of introduction and for laying out the overview of our topic today, which allows me to delve right into it. So just in terms of the format today, I will invite each of our esteemed panelists to speak for about 5 minutes. I will ask them to give us one key takeaway or one key theme they've gotten from out of this election in Singapore. And then we'll have a panel discussion amongst us. And then I'll open up to questions from the floor, from the audience, from you, the audience, in the last 15 or so minutes. So would you put in your questions into the Q&A tab on the bottom of your Zoom panel, and I shall take them and post them to our panelists today in the last 15 minutes. So to put in your questions as and when you can throughout this webinar. So delighted to be joined by a great panel today of experts and Singapore watchers. We have Michael Barr, who is Associate Professor of International Relations at Flinders University, the authority, amongst other things, on Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore. We have Ian Chong, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the National University of Singapore. His work examines international politics and security in Asia, but also is a keen and esteemed commentator on Singapore politics. Next, we have Rebecca Grace Tan, who is a lecturer at the National University of Singapore. Her research interests center on migration policies, nationalism, and multiculturalism in Singapore. Last but certainly not least, we have Terence Lee, who is currently Professor in New Media, Communication, and Cultural Studies at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. And his research interests are in Singapore media and politics. Welcome, all of you. And so we might get started with you, Terence. What's the key takeaway from this election?
Right. Okay. Thank you for Yao Tong and Ho Yong for your introduction. It's great to be amongst this panel, and I have a lot of respect for my colleagues here. Just getting started, I want to start perhaps by addressing a question that Professor Kevin Tan and I have had to respond to through the past few months, both in the lead up to the election, GE 2025, and in the aftermath, right? And the question is, or was, should we expect another Kevin and Terence general election book? So I'll answer that straight out so we stop getting it. I'm sorry to say the answer is we don't think so, rather than a straight no. The reason being that we started out back in 2011 with the trilogy in mind, and having completed the trilogy, the three books analyzing the elections of 2011, 2015, and 2020. Starting another trilogy seems a little bit too onerous, not least because we'll both be quite old by 2035. But really, while Kevin and I enjoyed the excitement as well as the agony of writing about the GEs, we both feel it's time to let younger scholars and observers contribute, and I think I'm glad to see that playing out in the media and so on. Now, I want to use I'm using this to introduce, not just because I want to plug the book, which I will in a minute. Um, I want to remind everyone that prior to 2011, GEs were effectively non-events, right? So when we started work on that election, one of our fears was that elections aren't very interesting for Singaporeans. But we pushed ahead because, and this you heard it here first, right? Because we wanted to show our Malaysian friends and scholars that Singaporeans can produce solid political analysis at a faster pace than our friends across the causeway. So we were able to launch our GE 2011 book 4 weeks after polling day. And that was an incredible fanfare. And I should acknowledge while I'm saying that Ethos Books has helped to make that happen. So thank you to Ho Fang and his team. I'm pleased, however, to note that the three GEs prior to this year's 2025 GE have become reference points to think about contemporary Singapore's electoral landscape, right? So I may as well do a plug now. So in case you have not heard, among our younger listeners or viewers, this is GE 2011 book. I don't know if I'm holding that up correctly. Voting in Change. Followed by 2015. This is the SG 50 election change in voting. And pandemic election 2020, voting in a time of change, right? I'll throw in the line to say you can get this from a good bookstore near or far from you, right? So this leads us in some ways to 2025. And I want to start, I just want to speak about two phrases or two lines that are picked up following the election that other observers have picked up. Number one, the term clear and strong mandate for Lawrence Wong and the PAP's landslide victory. Now, these two phrases are coined just about every election, right? And for me, these are two sides of the same coin. Why do I say that? Because any landslide victory gives the winning party a clear and strong mandate. But yet these declarations are problematic because the definition of landslide varies wildly and widely, right? So if Singapore's electoral outcomes are juxtaposed or measured against any other functioning liberal democracy anywhere, every single election outcome since independence would have been described as a landslide. So in that sense, it's rather meaningless. Um, now, what is more significant for this GE 2025 for me is that Lawrence Wong can say that he's earned his leadership stripes and to an extent his authority as Prime Minister. Not just because he led the PAP to a decisive victory, but because he has outperformed his predecessor on his very first outing, right? So this gives him that so-called landslide to lead. But what Lawrence Wong will do with his mandate remains to be seen. Okay, so we've seen him picking his ministers, his cabinet. In fact, I'll quote from Sudhir, who articulated in a post-GE piece in JOM, which Wong will we witness? And so the bits that we've seen during the election campaign and are, dare I say, rather optimistic. Now, having said that, I'll issue a caveat here to say that, and we all know this, campaign periods in Singapore are notoriously very, very short. So I'll mention three examples about what I mean by optimistic. Firstly, his the failure to mobilize POFMA, which I consider a miracle in its own right. has kept media communication scholars like myself with a shortage of material to critique. So I don't know what to write now for my next journal article. There's also a lack of sound bites, I think. The only one there are lines that you typically pick up at election rallies and across the media. There's been a lack of sound bites, and so the only one I feel that's worth mentioning is Lawrence Wong's philosophical appeal for voters to support the PAP, which mobilizes the irrational fear of what has become known in Singapore as a freak election outcome. So he said this, right? Who forms your government is now an existential question, which is I think is rather weird in many ways. And just to press on, and I think this is probably has already been mentioned, but it's worth repeating, is that Lawrence Wong was able to keep several senior ministers on a tight leash. And there were ministers who were surprisingly effectively silent through the entire election, right? So now I'm here. Two people come to mind, particularly those who live in very large black and white bungalows. No names mentioned, but so I thought that some of these things were quite interesting. Now, whether they can be attributed to Lawrence Wong's leadership, I don't know. But I think the ability to not do things as much as to do or say certain things was quite significant. So for me, the coming 5 years will be interesting to watch whether Lawrence Wong continues on this trajectory to silence certain people and to allow certain people to speak or encourage certain people to speak. I don't know. So it's be interesting to watch. So the elections kind of like predicting the future would be something I'll be looking out for. Okay, so that was the first phrase that I was referring to: clear, strong mandate and a landslide victory. Same thing. The second phrase I think that is I think Cherian George had said this first, which is a status quo election. And I am particularly intrigued by this because for me it's quite accurate. Not just for the election per se, but for also returning GEs to a non-event status. Now you will recall that was our original thought prior to 2011, and so it's for me that's significant in its own way. Perhaps as political scientists and academics, it's not really what we want to hear or what we want to think about. So I'll conclude very quickly now by saying if Kevin and I had started a fourth book, what would the title be? It would be Voting for No Change, unfortunately. So I'll end my short spiel here. Thank you.
Terence, and I think as you showed, the book covers the trilogy of books that you just were telling us about. It sort of gave us a very nice summary, I guess, of what's been going on in the past 10, 15 years. And we come back to many of these themes you've just raised. So thanks so much, Terence. Next, could I turn to Rebecca for your 5 minutes key takeaways from this election?
I think I just wanted to talk about this discussion of how we should read the elections, whether a status quo election and how much has changed. And I think there are a couple of things I want to observe. And I think so first, obviously, we mentioned, as Terence mentioned a bit earlier, is the fact that when we're talking about elections in Singapore, we don't have a lot of data to work with, right? So talking about what the trajectory is, we're really only looking at elections, competitive elections since 2011. So it's hard to be able to say, this is a pattern of behavior and change, or that it's status quo, right? So whether something's a freak election result or status quo, we're really only looking at quite a small sample size in terms of overall outcomes. What I do think is important to understand when we think about status quo is that in some ways, there is change going on. It is much more gradual, I think, than most people want to expect, including, and probably especially supporters of the opposition who would like to see a large swing, right? So when we have seen sort of big groundbreaking events in the context of Singapore, right? If we talk to people outside, the changes are fairly minimal, right? The loss of GRC, for example, in 2011, and then another loss in 2020, right, to the Workers' Party. And that seems, this seems like a non-event. This election seems a non-event insofar as there was not another loss. But if we think about change insofar as what is the longer term sustainable change in the future of politics in Singapore, then the consolidation of the Workers' Party vote share, the increase is perhaps more telling. And I think this is where the significance of 2025 for me was the shift in the way voters think about. At least we don't really have that kind of data. We only have one constituency to look at, which is Tampines. But I think we see a shift in the way we think about the opposition, right? So where previously it was always the KP versus the opposition, now we are starting to see, or we're starting to at least see revealing. I mean, I don't know whether this was always voter sentiment or voters' perception, but certainly we see that where there's a shift towards sort of seeing opposition to two camps. One is sort of the credible opposition, right? The parties that voters will vote for because they have good policies. So the Workers' Party, perhaps the SDP as well, and what other commentators such as Bertha Henson call the mosquito parties, right? So the ones that kind of buzz around, very, very small parties, largely not done particularly well. And I think what is significant there is that what it suggests is that change, I mean, it's not the most exciting thing, it's not the most sexy thing, right? But change, especially in the sort of a system of a hegemonic party, is much, much slower, right? Because we think about opposition parties being able to gain the resources and gain the attention of voters. This takes time, right? When we have seen big shifts in hegemonic parties kind of being destabilized in places like, for example, Malaysia, right? What we've often seen as a result is actually that it rapidly shifts back to the hegemonic party, right? So the non-hegemonic contester wins in one round of elections, but then because it is such a ground-shaking exercise, experience for voters, we often see the shift back. And where we have seen overall slower shifts, that shift is a lot more sustained, right? So I think that's something when we think little bit about it being, when people are disappointed with the results, you thought, for example, Punggol might fall, or to the Workers' Party, or Tampines, and granted, everybody was really disappointed on some of the results, especially if you're a supporter of the opposition. I think it's important to understand sort of the longer process and what the implications are. Because this sort of freak election frame of all of a sudden we'll have a new government, firstly was just numerically unlikely, improbable. I wouldn't say impossible, improbable. But also the question, of course, is what sort of the long-term outcomes would be. I think when we think about that, we want to see it more as I sort of always think of the imagery of a very slow lava flow. It doesn't, or sort of slow weathering processes, right? We want to see. I think 2025 demonstrates that we're seeing a slow weathering process, and we want to see it neither as kind of as a status quo election. It's only, it's the same old. I don't know what the same old is. We don't have a lot of data to be able to say it's the same old, right? 2011, was not the same old. 2015 and 2020 certainly were not either, right? So we really have 3 previous elections to meaningfully talk about. So what counts as status quo? I don't know, because we're seeing slow changes. They might be not as big as we expect, but are big changes necessarily good? And I think that's something we want to think about when we either want to project into the future and say, what are we going to see? Big swings in votes are not necessarily, or even swings in government aren't necessarily always desirable, nor sustained. So I think that's something we want to think about when we kind of throw out terms like status quo, or landslide elections or mandates, that they can shift, but they do shift slowly. Yeah, that's me.
Much, Rebecca. Again, we'll definitely be returning some of these themes during our discussion and perhaps Q&A too. So thanks very much for that. Just at this point, I want to remind the audience that you can send in your questions in the Q&A tab that's on the bottom of your Zoom panel screen. Send your questions and then we will take them in the last 15 minutes or so in this webinar session. Next, could I go to Ian for your 5 minutes as to key takeaways from this election?
Right. Thank you very much, Ho Yong. Thank you, Masa and Siak, for having me here. So I guess in my 5 minutes, I'm going to make a couple of points about how I see political parties as working in Singapore. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that relates to electorate, and I'll end off by perhaps being a little bit different from Terence, because I do think that there are sort of things relating to POFMA and also the media scene in general that are worth watching. It's the dogs that didn't bark that I think are quite interesting. So first off, I think one point that I'd like to build off Rebecca is this idea that there is a consolidation in the party scene in Singapore, right? So it is quite clear that there's coalescence of voter support around obviously the PAP, but also the Workers' Party. So the obvious question is why? I felt looking at the various political parties, two things stand out. One is the fact that you have the Workers' Party and the PAP to, I guess, to some extent, being able to offer a positive agenda. So when you look at voting, it's not so, I mean, in the past, there's a assumption that Singapore voters who vote for parties other than the PAP are angry and they want to lash out, and it's a protest vote. But what I noticed this time is that the parties that were playing on the sort of protest vote idea tended to do less well. It was the parties that had a clearer sort of vision of who they were, who they wanted to be, that stood out. So the PAP, not so much in their manifesto, but in the way that they sort of present themselves and as the sort of dominant party in Singapore, and the sort of vision that they had about growth and all that. But I think if you look at the Workers' Party's manifesto, they had a very systematic approach, a very long, but a very systematic approach to how they thought of themselves and how they thought about their role in Singapore and Singapore's future. And I think voters gravitated to that to the extent that the PSP and the SDP had some of these ideas. I think that also showed up in some of the support. And if you look at the independent candidates, they were quite interesting because I think they were also trying hard to offer some sort of positive vision. Now, for the parties that didn't do as well, one of the things that I think they had in common was that it was less clear what they were offering, apart from being a protest vote. I do agree that, the fact, talk about sort of slogan that has hung around, mosquito parties. That's a sort of phrase that stuck around. But I think that's a little bit uncharitable. I think what they do is offer Singaporean voters a chance to go to the polls and to cast a vote. I think that in terms of the democratic process, that's important. So going to there's a related point to this is, I think also party machinery makes a huge difference. This of course goes without saying for the PAP, but if you look at what the PAP was doing in some of these constituencies, for example, in Bukit Panjang, where Paul Tambaya of the SDP was contesting, I mean, he was noting that the PAP was able to offer $1 oil, $1 rice to voters in certain parts of the constituency. I mean, that takes resources, right? That's not something that other political parties can bring to bear. One of the reasons why Marine Parade Braddell Heights was left uncontested was because Pritam Singh had laid this out pretty clearly. It would have stretched the Workers' Party's resources. But insofar as the Workers' Party was able to consolidate their party machinery and the resources they had at hand, you see them do fairly well in the constituencies where they contested. And again, sorry, contra Terence's claim, the Workers' Party did gain 2 NCMP seats, right? And that does reflect the way that their party machinery worked. And that was something that I felt that the other opposition parties lacked. And so that makes a difference. Going forward, I think political parties, if they're able to build up their machinery, I think they will be in, they will have significant advantages. So that's the part that we sometimes forget, that these sort of the way that parties work, right? They also need an institution behind them. We sometimes forget that in Singapore. The last point that I'd like to make quite quickly is I thought the non-use of POFMA was actually quite interesting because there were false claims that were made, but they were made against opposition figures. There was a claim about Alia Mata saying that she cared about Palestine more than bread and butter issues, which was false. That claim came out right before cooling off day. Nothing was done about it, right? This is on Singapore Matters, that pro-PAP Facebook page. Now, there was also various other claims. There was a last-minute claim about Michael Deng being gay, which again, there's no evidence to point to that. Nothing was done. And during this election, we saw extensive use of bots. When you see Harpreet Singh, or a lot of bots were sort of, they would try to overwhelm the messaging in the comment section. Again, nothing was done. And the PAP complained about some use of bots as well, but I actually looked at these pages. The use was quite different. The fact that you have a lot of accounts that had no history, very few friends, that suggests inauthentic coordinated online behavior. So for all the online rules and laws that we have, if we are interested fundamentally about electoral integrity, it leaves an open question as to why there was not so much of an even-handed application of these tools that we have on hand. Okay, let me end there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ian. And now may I turn to Michael for 5 minutes for your key takeaways from this election.
Thank you. Those of you who follow my work will be aware that I don't really focus on elections. I'm really looking at long-term trends and machinations within the cabinet, within the ruling elite, and changes to the construction of that elite. Hence, for me, elections since 2011 have really been background, essential background, an important background, and background that helps form the picture, but still background, which is a big step up, because before 2011, elections were just white noise. So they've become much more important. But that perspective, that analytical perspective, does colour what I'm going to say, because I've only got 2 points that I really want to make in this opening gambit. And they're both along the lines of what I was originally talking about. First thing is that Lawrence Wong has proved himself not just to be photogenic and not just to be personable through the screen and possibly even face-to-face, but he has shown himself to be a very competent politician within Singapore. Now, I thought watching online, I thought his campaign was terrible, but I was wrong. He knows his constituency and he knows the advantages he has. Yes, we can complain about all of the fact that it's not a level playing field and all of the advantages that the government gives themselves, but that's part of the deal. Now, he's got Shanmugam as his gatekeeper, and now it seems that Edwin Tong might be the sorcerer's apprentice, the next in line. So he's got that. He doesn't have to worry about the POFMAs and that sort of thing. He has someone to do that and do it very well, and to use the law for that purpose. So that's the context. But from there, he was able to not just structure a gerrymander, but also even in constituencies where there were good candidates, strong opposition candidates, to have a swing against them. Now that's politics. And what he did, I was interviewed on the ABC, and I said that Lawrence Wong reiterated again and again the message that trust the PAP. I think I got that slightly wrong. It's not just trust the PAP, it's be afraid without the PAP. You need the PAP. And he was able to use that. And I wouldn't have thought that that was a very effective weapon. He did, and he was right. He's been proven right. So the question then becomes, he's now established himself as the leader, the ongoing leader. He has the position now. He's in a position now to be able to consolidate his hold with his status within cabinet, and to build his position if he chooses to. He's currently Lee Hsien Loong's man, but he now has the standing to start exercising sharp elbows if he has sharp elbows. So we'll wait and see what happens there. This is the second point, I thought there was one more telltale sign that Lawrence Wong might be trying to look after himself rather than just be the gopher for Lee Hsien Loong. And I thought it was the treatment of Ng Chee Meng. Now, Ng Chee Meng has to have been Lee Hsien Loong's man. He was he lost at the last election, and then he was given a cushy job. He sails through as the NTUC Secretary General, and then apparently makes a mess of that. But and ready to land in a safe seat and join cabinet. He wasn't given a safe seat. He was put into an SMC. Now, the last high flyer who was put into an SMC was Tan Pei-Ling, and basically having made a mess of in Marine Parade in 2011, or was it 15? She was then given an SMC and told to sink or swim, and she swam. You can't quite say that about he might have swum, but geez, half drowned by the time he swam. So, and lo and behold, and then all this stuff comes out about the photos just after the election, the timing of which is amazing. I wonder, and I don't have evidence for this, but I do seriously wonder, how is it that he was put into an SMC, a vulnerable SMC in the first place? And I wonder whether that was Lawrence Wong exercising some of the power that he already did have to cut down someone who just might be someone he doesn't want there. Now, I don't know the answer to that, but it does tally with one or two other little things. And then I'll stop there.
Thanks very much indeed, Michael. And we'll pick up on that in the panel discussion that we are just about to go into. So again, a note to the audience, please keep your questions coming in. I do see your questions. We will take them either at the end of the session, those last 10-15 minutes, or I will probably read them actually in the course of this panel discussion, which I want to focus on the question as to what's the trajectory of Singapore politics going forward from this, right? Let's look forward. Given the situation, this is we seem to agree this is a status quo election result. And this has come after a protracted leadership transition, I would say, in the PAP, the ruling party. The question I think to start off is, does this mean that the PAP's resilience and dominance has actually outlasted Lee Kuan Yew and Lee Hsien Loong, the first and third prime ministers? Maybe a question for Michael, as you did cover this during your remarks, but also to everyone else. And Michael, you seem to suggest that it might also be the political ingenuity of Lawrence Wong in trying to control the party's dominance. So which is it? Is it the party system that sort of has guaranteed this dominance, or is it Lawrence Wong's ingenuity?
The election was Lawrence Wong's to lose, but he didn't lose it. Contrary to a lot of the hype, he didn't make any great gains either. But nevertheless, he held the ground and he held it well. And that's what he needed to do. No, we still need to wait and see. But now the ruling elite clearly has the breathing space of some years, probably a decade, before it's likely to be facing an existential challenge. I mean, this election result could have been a serious challenge for it. It didn't happen. So yes, we are seeing the current leadership system going forward. I think Lawrence Wong will actually make some little tweaks to the construction of the elite and the coalition, if you like, that is behind cabinet. We'll have to wait and see about that. And yes, he has consolidated his authority, but if he doesn't choose to use that, or if he doesn't use it well, then it will all be squandered, because he still has a lot of ambitious men around him. So he's made sure that none of them are deputy prime minister, but they're still there.
Michael, I was wondering if anyone else amongst us panelists wanted to chip in there too. I'm
happy to weigh in on this. I mean, there's a lot of focus on Lee Kuan Yew and Lee Hsien Loong, but to some degree, it's always mystified me as to why that's the case. Like with any dominant party anywhere in the world, it's a coalition, right? It's a winning coalition. So yes, you have important front-facing people who have a lot of sway, but they cannot by themselves, keep everything under control and move things forward. So I think it's important to remember that beyond that phase, there is a machine, there's a party machine. And it's based on people who like the status quo. It's based on people who are attached with the NTUC, so on and so forth, right? And I think also we have to remember that when we talk about Lawrence Wong's performance this time around, it happened in the wake of the Trump tariffs, after Liberation Day, and for very skittish and kiasu kiasi kiasing who kind of Singaporean voters, that they would flee to what they're familiar with, and that happened to be the PAP and the Workers' Party. And I mean, there was I think what Lawrence Wong did, to echo Michael, was to play up that sort of skittishness and fear within the Singapore electorate about not having a mandate. I mean, mathematically, a party that contests all the seats in Singapore and only wins by 50% plus one in each of the smallest SMCs and the smallest GRCs can have a simple majority with just shy of 25% of the popular vote. And by that same token, they can get a 2/3 supermajority with 50% plus one vote in all the smallest SMCs and GRCs, with just shy of 33% of the popular vote. And no other political party was contesting all the seats. There was no mathematical reason that the PAP's mandate would be challenged, but people bought that. People were fearful, and they were sold on that idea.
Right, so flight to safety is what you think we're seeing here, Ian. Here I'm thinking of a previous leadership transition in the PAP. This is the political historian in me talking, I guess, that in 1991, when Goh Chok Tong took over in his maiden outing as PAP leader from Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister, and that didn't go too well compared to this time round, 1991. So opposition won 3 seats. That was seen as a huge loss. Relatively quite low vote share, 61%, I think it was. Although Goh Chok Tong then sort of wrestled back, I think he went to the heights of 70+% in the next election. So was this a flight to safety election result that we're seeing?
I think you're overemphasizing Goh Chok Tong because he's not a Lee. If you look at Lee Hsien Loong's election, the one he led as Prime Minister in 2001, he did very well, right? So I think we have to look at people and the context, right, and not just think just because they have a certain surname or family name, they naturally would get some sort of an outcome. I think that is not a particularly scientific way of looking at things.
Okay.
I think I wanted to add something. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Terence.
Oh, no. Rebecca,
Terence, then Rebecca.
Oh,
Terence,
okay.
then Rebecca.
No, I don't know about the flight to safety. I'm glad you mentioned that. Ho Yong, I'm also glad that Ian spoke about the global situation with Trump and all that. Although they didn't seem to feature, I think they did. But I'm not sure about the flight to safety mentality for this particular election. Having said that, we've seen elections around the world in recent weeks and months that had the result very much because of global situations at the moment. I think I'm thinking of Canada, even Australia, and so. But then again, in the Singapore's context, as I mentioned in my opening spiel, right, it's the baseline. The PAP, as as the ruling party, is the baseline. So to kind of say flight to safety mentality, what's the other option, right? There isn't another real option for government anyway. So I'm not sure that the concept of flight to safety actually really applies in Singapore's context. I thought I'll just say that. I'll let Rebecca continue the rest here.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of add on to Ian's point, I think, about the understanding of machinery. And I think there are 2 elements that are really important when we think about shifting away from a sort of personalistic interpretation of politics around, big men. One is obviously institutions, and the fact that rules of games, are there. And yes, while there is obviously a 2/3 majority in Parliament, so you could potentially change the rules of game very quickly, and we have seen those changes. Insofar as they benefit, the ruling party who controls the 2/3, we probably won't see any changes, right? So regardless of who the Prime Minister is, for as long as the self-interest of the ruling party that controls the ability to change those rules, is not going to change those rules, right? So I think it's about institutions, control of institutions. But I think the other thing that we want to think of that gets obscured when we think about sort of personalities is we ignore sort of political culture or norms that are built up over time and only really slowly change over time, right? With, say, changes in generations or changes in political attitudes, you know, as people get socialized over time. Because a lot of, I think, voters have, I mean, we see this in a lot of studies on voter behavior in general, is that, you know, voters stick with the same behavior that has been practiced over time. And so the shifts we see in elections, electoral politics, tend to be a result of new cohorts of voters, not necessarily a big shifts in voter behavior, like, you know, all of a sudden it's, you know, something happened in the world and we're going to see a huge shift. So I think cultures of whether, you know, Singaporeans are, say, risk averse and so forth. Firstly, I'm not sure that's unique to Singapore. I think it's Terence's point, right, is that we see this sort of return to or wanting to maintain what is tried and tested, risk averse behavior amongst voters all over the world. So it's not something that is specific to Singapore as much as we might want to try to talk about it as such. Not really. I also say it's definitely not irrational. I think, you know, there's a tendency to be like, oh, you know, they're sticking with the bad choice because they're fearful. And fear is perfectly rational, kind of survival instinct. It's based, I mean, upon evidence of, you know, who's gotten you through financial crisis before, right? The Asian financial crisis, COVID, and so forth. And I think whether we like it or not, you know, Singaporeans use that track record to make decisions. And I think that's ingrained into the political culture, right? Into political attitudes of, you know, what's worked and what's not. And being risk averse is not atypical for voter behavior. Singaporeans are not different from any other voters, nor is it necessarily bad behavior. So I think that's something you want to think of, that culture, this culture is likely to maintain. And until the opposition has the opportunity to prove themselves as being similarly sort of steady hands at the helm, and that's why I think this argument of like having positive policies and so forth, then we will see, you know, voters start shifting behavior towards parties like the Workers' Party, but not necessarily to the more erratic, I think, opposition parties that don't seem to have that kind of stability and certainly, I think, especially in times of crisis, but even absent crisis, not that there is an election that's absent crisis, but, you know, certainly in this general election.
Right. Can I quickly jump in on that? I think also that sort of skittishness, that risk aversity, you know, that comes across also in the way that Lawrence Wong had been campaigning. How he was talking about how, you know, he would not be able to work, you know, without a strong mandate, without a strong sort of PAP voice. But apart from the numbers which I just talked about earlier, right? He was saying, I mean, essentially what he's saying, as I read it, is if there are more opposition parties asking questions, you know, it would be a problem. But practically, it's not, because that's not how voting inside Parliament works, right? Voting in Parliament works by essentially by numbers. So, you know, the fact that people were sold by this idea, oh, if there are a lot more questions, things would be less efficient, things would not really work as well. That sort of risk aversity is very much ingrained in the Singapore voters' mindset, as Rebecca had laid out. And these kinds of elements we shouldn't forget, right? And the sort of conditions, sometimes it's easy to sort of drop off, but we should really be quite mindful of them.
Mm.
May I just jump in for one little riposte to Ian? I don't think anyone has ever suggested that the Prime Minister's surname determines elections or determines how well the party does. But the coalition that is the PAP, and behind that is the ruling elite in the civil service, in the military, throughout the whole of society. It was someone called Lee who built that. And then Goh Chok Tong and Lee Hsien Loong have made changes to that. That is something that is very real and very powerful. Now, the two Lees have held inordinate power, not so much in the constituency. Lee Kuan Yew did, because he was good at that sort of thing. Lee Hsien Loong was not very good at politics. You look at his electoral record, he hasn't done that well in his 20 years of power. So, but the Lee name has carried, unfairly, inordinate authority within the elite. That is still going on. That has not yet been broken. But Lawrence Wong now has, if he chooses to, the chance to start challenging that, or if not challenging that, at least inserting himself into it so that he can carry it forward. As I don't know, I don't have any great high expectations that he will do that. On the other hand, I estimated his political skills, so I'm not going to go too far out on a limb judging what he's going to do in cabinet over the next 5-10 years.
Thank you, Michael. I do want to go to questions in the audience because there are many good questions coming in, but I do want to pose one question to the panel, if I may. And we've been talking about the leadership and about the PAP, the ruling party. But I want to talk about the Workers' Party. I think we are seeing a consolidation of votes around, as some of you have pointed out. So can I pose you this question? What do you see are the future prospects of the Workers' Party? Are we looking a move are you seeing a move towards a two-party system? Or I think in the case of Terence, I think in the book series that you were just sharing about, I think it was Pinger, lumping our friend, a 1.5 party system. And obviously Pinger, coming from as a Japan watcher, is thinking of the Japanese model of the opposition, which is sort of a smaller opposition than the two-party system would suggest. Thoughts here? Any thoughts?
I think I want to mention, Rebecca mentioned just now about the 2/3 majority for the purposes of constitutional change, right? And I think Workers' Party had very expressly stated that as one of their shorter term or medium term goals, which is not to claim government, but to disrupt, if you like, the PAP's power to pretty much change the constitution almost at will. So I see that as their more immediate. When I say immediate, I don't mean by the next election. We're talking about a few elections down the road. So for me, that I think is what the Workers' Party is trying to do, is trying to demonstrate, I suppose, stability. Now there has been some disruption with Razeh Khan's situation in the last round, with Pritam Singh being branded a liar, which I think any fair observer would say that fell really flat on the PAP, which is why that wasn't mobilized, that wasn't invoked, pretty much at all through the whole campaign. So look, I think the Workers' Party's trying to go the distance by maintaining as much of a stability that mirrors, if you like, the PAP as much as possible. So I see that as and I think they are achieving that already. I'm looking at the way in which the vote share in the two GRCs have been consolidated, in particular, and in fact there's been a slight increase. So I think you could say that Workers' Party is there for the fairly long haul. That's my expectation anyway. Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean,
Workers' Party.
Yeah, so the Workers' Party, I think their view is on consolidation, and it's about building up their own party machinery, getting more volunteers, getting more people to join the party, and importantly, getting more donors, right? Because to do things like the $1 oil and rice thing, you require donors. So we don't require transparency of party finances, but you probably can guess that comes from donors somewhere. So those are the things that the Workers' Party will build on. I suppose what's interesting in the Singapore case is many people have been talking about opposition unity for a long time. There are two ways you can go about what you might see as opposition unity. One is by cooperation, right? You have the different parties cooperating with each other, going on a similar platform, so on and so forth, what we had seen in Malaysia. Or it can happen by consolidation. So some of the smaller political parties become less competitive. The bigger opposition parties sort of take over more of that space, and as they grow, they become more competitive. That's another way we can get opposition unity. So I think the Workers' Party is probably going to try and consolidate over on the east, and we'll see what happens when they can sort of move further west of the CTE, so to speak. And just as a small point in response to Michael, I think this is quite an interesting point about the Lee Kuan Yew. I think it comes down to how much truck you put onto Lee personally, as opposed to how much you think that the first generation of PAP leaders was important in building up that coalition, but having Lee front it, because the other part of the coalition are the big businesses, and which I think are very much aligned with the PAP. So that's not completely known right now. I suppose at some point in the future, when we have more access to archives and so on, we may be able to tell.
Okay, thank you, Ian. I would like to cluster a few questions from the audience, and I think a few of them actually just play off what we've just been discussing and what some of you have raised. So if I may cluster a few and I'll leave it to whoever would like to respond. The first question I see here is, what's the likelihood that a mosquito party, I think that was brought up by Rebecca, will ever win a GRC or SMC or just win, literally? There was a question about opposition alliances too, which Ian just raised. And let's see, will there be a higher chance of an opposition alliance amongst the non-mosquito parties moving forward, excluding WP? And then just very finally, if I may cluster this, party machinery was something that one of us raised during the remarks. How do parties build machinery? Is there any way for us to support the building of such a machinery? So with that, any responses?
Just to be clear, I don't. I think the language of mosquito party is sort of having negative connotations. I don't
Yeah.
agree with it. I think it helpfully represents. I think the way the sort of the impact in the sense that it's seen as an annoyance to the PAP. I think maybe I think it's probably a fair way of interpreting the framing mosquito, that it doesn't seem to pose a big challenge, but seen as an annoyance. You're participating, contesting an election. You take away about 20% of my vote. But there's no significant chance that you will pose. I mean, unless you're an Aedes mosquito or something, pose a significant risk, right? So I think that's one way of thinking a little bit about mosquito parties. Not that they're not significant, but they're seen as an annoyance to the PAP in terms of the relative threat that they pose, I suppose, as opposed to, I don't know, some other animal metaphor for the Workers' Party. I don't know what would be an appropriate one. But I think the likelihood of a sort of mosquito party, right? I think maybe here it'd be helpful to kind of conceptualize a little bit and kind of build up how we would categorize a party as a mosquito party as opposed to a non-mosquito party, whatever that would be. But I don't think Bertha Henson necessarily does that particularly well, at least when she coined the term. I mean, one is obviously the impact that has upon the PAP, and I think that's tied to what we talked a little bit about in terms of party machinery, right? And also policy positions, which I think Ian mentioned a bit earlier. So the first, obviously, is whether you have a well-established party machinery that you could potentially win a constituency, right? So answering that question about whether you're likely to win a GRC or SMC is that, firstly, a lot of mosquito parties need. So some of the smaller parties just cannot contest a GRC, or if they do, they're basically putting all their eggs in a single constituency, right? So for example, I'm thinking of what was the newest party that came out? I cannot remember which one it
Red
was.
Dot United?
The only constituency sorry? No, not Red Dot United.
Red Dot United,
The newest party. No, they only contested one constituency. I need to pull up my notes. So when you only contest one GRC, odds are you don't have the machinery, obviously, to get a widespread to walk the ground enough. So I think that's one thing, is that the party machinery, you don't have it, so that probably makes you a mosquito party because you just can't contest in a long, sustained process, as opposed to somewhere like the SDP, for example, that even though it doesn't contest a lot of constituencies, obviously able to gain enough ground that it doesn't just get the 20% protest vote. The other thing as well is, of course, having strong policy positions, right? They're not just irritations in terms of presenting very extreme policy positions or policy positions that are so vacuous that voters say, I don't know why I would vote for you, right? So policy positions that seem to be well thought out, that are are detailed enough, so we can look at things like manifestos as kind of a sign of would they be taken seriously? And I think that's a big thing. And also then thinking a little bit about machinery, kind of the resources you can attract, right? The individuals you can attract. I think that's the other, maybe a sign of a mosquito party, right? It will depend on the kind of credibility of the candidates, because some of the smaller parties just really did not have very credible candidates. I mean, you can look at the speeches and you can see the ridicule, for example, some of the opposition candidates that they received for their campaign speeches, and sort of the cringiness surrounding that. Sort of look at the way the Gen Zs talk about it and looking at how voters perceive that. You're more likely irritations to the PAP, insofar as they add to the noise, right? So if we use Michael's frame of like white noise, it creates a lot of noise in election, not necessarily a lot of substance. Even though it's obviously good that people can vote for them should they want to, but in terms of significant impacts upon say, hold a parliament and so forth, that might be a mosquito party. And I think to answer the question, long shot, is it likely? Until they stop being mosquito parties, meaning they had the machinery, they had the policy positions, they are able to track the candidates, they will, no, it's unlikely. They will continue to get about 20% of the vote, maybe, but getting 50%?
Yeah. It's actually, I'm very tickled by certain things at every election that pops up. I mean, the last election, I looked at the celebrity status of individuals. Jamus Lim, for example, his famous cockles, warming the cockle of his heart. I think that's what it was. And I think the mosquito analogy emerged this election, and you're kind of trying to scratch your head. We get it when somebody says that, but we don't actually know what the mosquito party is, right? And then I was going to mention Jeremy Tan, the independent candidate, the first independent in many elections. And of course, why did he become a minor sensation? It's simply because he was able to say things, he rattled things off his head. You can tell that he's got lots of things in his head. He was able to say things that resonate with many, many, many voters. It's quite funny in one of the videos where he talked about, pretty much, these are my words, paraphrase, cut the crap about, coming from poor background, humble beginnings and all that. He was able to kind of sell his own story in that space. So those things resonate with a lot of people. And I think that is, whether you're a mosquito party, pardon that term again, or whether you are, established party, but not yet able to gain traction. Here, I'm thinking of SDP in some ways. It's what the messaging that resonates with potential voters. Now, they may not cast you the full vote to allow you to win the constituency, but they give you credit for your ability to cut through with certain messages. So I'm thinking about here in Australia, where there are many single issue parties that exist. They would be the equivalent of your mosquito parties. I think Michael might agree with me on that one. But yet they reappear election after election after election after election. So it's so for me it's a sign of, you could say, a mature electoral landscape. It's a sign of the fact that people have the freedom to put themselves forward in whatever issues there are. So I think that it's not helpful. Now, whether they can gain traction in Singapore, I doubt it. Not forgetting that we have a simple plurality system where, in order to win, you just have to have a simple majority. So I think that those things need to be understood. For me, I wanted to say this at the very start when Yao Tong approached me to do this, right? Was that I think voter election in the Singapore context is critical. We're nowhere near a situation where voters know what elections are about, what the elections are really about in a democratic environment. Yeah.
And so let me jump in. I think the term mosquito parties, as I said earlier, is a little bit uncharitable.
Yeah.
They do allow citizens to exercise their right to vote, and I think that's important. But that having been said, this then brings us to the question about party machinery, which really begs the question: what happens off elections? We think about elections as these moments that congeal attention, but what happens off elections are important as well. So are parties getting donations? Are they getting volunteers? Are they able to walk the ground, provide activities to let their presence be felt, and also to develop policy platforms prior to the election? So those are the things that need to take place. And for parties, smaller parties, to win, they should be thinking about how to get those resources, or to consolidate resources in order to be in that kind of a position.
I wasn't going to
Thank you
speak
much,
on this. I wasn't going to speak on this, but I will say this. Yes, I think voters are looking for serious candidates and serious parties. One of the things that an opposition party, to be taken seriously, needs to do is to work hard between elections and to be professional and build up an infrastructure, which means money, all those sorts of things. The problem is that in Singapore, you can work the ground as much as you like, and that constituency may not be there next time. And which means that all your work can go for nothing unless you have a mechanism to spread yourself like the Workers' Party currently has, so that you can basically cover anything in a zone. and you can't be done out of it like that. Now, without that sort of seriousness, I don't think that parties should be contesting. It's nice to say that people have a choice to vote, but unfortunately for the opposition, but it's unfortunately not many people take that option in the further west you go. Now, so yes, I think all of the political parties, including the SDP and the PSP, which are very serious parties, I do think that they really need to be looking at what they can achieve. Not just what do they want to do, what are they passionate about, but what are they trying to achieve, and work out a way to do that. Then they can be taken more seriously, because and the Workers' Party needs to have the same conversation with itself as well, but for slightly different reasons.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to propose to do something quite ambitious, which is that firstly, I will ask if you could stay on about 5 to 10 minutes more past the scheduled end time of this webinar, which has just passed. I will cluster together the remaining questions, which is quite a fair bit. So great to have these questions. Thank you very much. And I would leave it to you, the panelists, to as your closing remarks, pick or respond to any of these questions, which I will sort of throw at you, as it were. And here we have a question that was mentioned earlier on during our session. Given the lack of direct voting data and really lack of a lot of data in Singapore, what are some of the proxies you might look to understand voting patterns? There's a question here as to Prime Minister Lawrence Wong's choice not to appoint a second Deputy Prime Minister. Is there really a chance that a challenger could oust him from the Prime Minister's seat, and how would that happen, if at all? I see a very long and thoughtful comment from an attendee about, I think the question is about whether parties have evolved together with Singapore society, whether leaders, parties, and society have evolved together. I'll leave it to you to comment if any of you would like to pick it up. And I think finally, independent candidates that was being raised too, performing better than small parties. What's the future for independent candidates in Singapore? And what does it say about the opposition vis-a-vis independent candidates? If I might go in reverse order of when you speaking earlier on today, Michael, maybe I could go to you first. Closing remarks based on any of these questions.
Okay, just the DPM question. There's no serious chance now that anyone's going to be challenging Lawrence Wong in the next few years. But there are many ways that someone can undermine him, can flex their muscles, can have their way, can make life more difficult than it needs to be, or build up their own power base, short of that sort of challenge. And yes, and that's what Lawrence Wong is concerned about. He wants to build his power base so that he's consolidated. Then he doesn't have to think about those sort of challenges. If this election had gone very badly, he'd be looking over his shoulder. But that hasn't happened.
Thank you, Michael. Ian, any closing remarks?
Yes. So on independent candidates, I think right now Jeremy Tan in particular has done sort of well with 36%, but we have to look at the fact that these are SMCs. For them to break out, they have to have some sort of coalescence to, be more than one ward, right, in a GRC. So I mean, maybe also around individuals, there are sort of individuals who contest in other systems who sort of do well. So they can consolidate resources around them. That's certainly possible. We'll have to see if that happens. On the PM question, I think that one is an interesting one. I agree with Michael's assessment, but we do have to understand that the PAP is a party, it's an institution, so they have a mechanism. Their CEC will decide who the leaders will be. And so it's not really that much of a shock to the system. They have mechanisms to deal with that. On the bit about voting data, I think that's the real sort of loss, I think, for Singapore. We don't understand, as citizens, we don't understand our society well enough. We don't have enough regular polling data. We don't understand what other citizens care about. That's an unfortunate sort of element. Perhaps there can be more polling done. Perhaps there can be more release of more fine-grained data with voting. So for instance, rather than just know the constituencies, we know that with counting agents, they know which of the sort of specific, they can know basically down to each specific block. Well, if that information is available, why not make it public as well? So at least we can understand some of the way that our politics work. As citizens, we can make better and more informed choices. We can better understand each other.
Thank you, Ian. Rebecca.
So I think that being said, I think there is one proxy that we are seeing shifts in, and that is age. So seeing voter attitudes when it comes to age. So where we are seeing, for example, obviously younger voters do not have are more likely to be undecided about their decisions. We saw that already in the data provided. But also we are seeing younger voters in general be more supportive of the opposition, or rather be less supportive of PAP, especially when it engages what's seen as underhand techniques. So I think what we will see over time perhaps is, and we didn't talk so much about POFMA, but I think that's why we are seeing in general less strong-handed approaches, especially during elections where it's very visible, right? When you kind of come down heavy on opposition party. And I think that's what happened in 2020, and that's why we didn't see it so much in 2025, kind of the backlash or the counterproductiveness of kind of engaging in very strong tactics against the opposition like POFMA. So I think we will see a shift in elections towards being more conciliatory, at least on the surface, saying, we want to listen to younger voters and recognizing that voters no longer kind of think that the strong arming of the opposition is a desirable thing to do, and no longer accept that, and in fact punish the PAP, I think, for engaging in such tactics. So I think elections will shift a little bit in that sense. And so we might see changes, for example, to law boundaries or gender and all this stuff, sort of relegation, we might see shifts. Now,
and last but not least, Terence.
Yes, I want to address the very long comment or / question that one of the attendees said, which is talking about the fact that, the world is not static, neither is Singapore, right? So electoral political parties shift with different people, and I think that's definitely true. And one of I think in some ways you could use that to critique what happened to Tan Cheng Bock and the SPP in that sense, right? In the sense that they've gradually lost ground, even though they had representation within Parliament. And I think that, a lot of what was articulated by that party, the members, did not really resonate with many Singaporeans. They loved the old time, love to see Tan Cheng Bock, walking the ground, and, hype beast was the term that was hype beast Akong was the one that was given at the last election. But I think that that has shifted, and I agree with the comment that Lawrence Wong is different from Lee Hsien Loong, and likewise Pritam Singh is different from Loh Tia Kiang. So in many ways, the parties need to build succession, generational changes along the way, and gradually doing so. I think to Lawrence Wong's credit, he's done that by bringing in 28 new candidates, new MPs into the party. So I think Singaporeans, whether they deliberately want to see or not, there's a certain comfort in knowing that new people are coming onto the scene, and running the country, or learning how to run the country, as it is. So for me, those things are important in thinking about elections and what they do for the country as a whole. So for me, those, no, absolutely right. Political parties can't remain static. Even as they build their machinery, it has to comprise a broader church, as it were. Yeah.
Thank you, Terence. I think that's a good note to end on. We are out of time. In fact, we are about 9 minutes past scheduled time. So thank you very much to you, the audience, for staying on past the hour. And remains for me to thank our panelists, Michael, Terence, Rebecca, and Ian, for coming on this panel and sharing their thoughts. I shall look forward to hearing what you have to say, maybe, and to test some of these theories in 5 years' time or sooner. But until then, thank you very much, and I hope to see all of you again in some way. Thank you and bye.